King John of England is often remembered in popular culture for being the villain in tales of Robin Hood, or as the hapless ruler who lost vast territories in France and begrudgingly agreed to the Magna Carta. But if you strip away the legend, you find a man whose daily life and reign were filled with monotonous administrative struggles, endless travel between castles, and the minutiae of managing a kingdom in constant financial strain. Understanding John requires looking not only at the political failures but at the ordinary, persistent challenges that consumed his attention, sometimes with consequences far more lasting than the headlines of rebellion and taxation. John was born on December 24, 1166, the youngest son of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Being the youngest, he was not expected to inherit anything significant, a fact that shaped his early years. While his elder brothers, Henry the young king, Richard and Geoffrey, were groomed for significant military or political roles, John's childhood was a mixture of education in courtly life and moments of exclusion from substantial power. Unlike a future king who might dream of ruling vast territories, John spent his youth observing the machinations of his brothers, the tensions with their father, and the endless negotiations over lands that were, at the time, more like chess pieces than inherited domains. The details of these early years may seem dull: family quarrels, courtly lessons, and occasional jabs at his inexperience. But they laid the groundwork for John's insecurities and the meticulous attention to small details he would later obsess over as king. Ascending to the throne in 1199, after the death of his brother Richard, the first John inherited not only England but also the Angevin territories in France. Yet, what John inherited was not a cohesive empire. It was a loosely connected collection of duchies, counties, and lordships, each with its own traditions, laws, and obligations. His first task as king was not to embark on glorious military campaigns, although those would come, but to understand the administration of these lands. He had to study the records of taxation, oversee the collection of feudal dues, and manage the often tiresome demands of local nobility. These tasks, poring over ledgers, corresponding with sheriffs, adjudicating petty disputes, might seem uninspiring today, but they were the bedrock of royal authority. Every small failure in administration could spark rebellion or loss of loyalty, and John quickly learned that his reign would be measured as much by the handling of mundane details as by battlefield victories. John's personality, as chronicled by contemporary and later sources, reveals a man of sharp intelligence and considerable bureaucratic skill, though one prone to irritability and indecision. He was capable of extraordinary attention to detail. Surviving records show that John spent countless hours on seemingly trivial matters, verifying the dimensions of castles, examining the precise wording of legal documents, monitoring the movement of coins, and meticulously cataloguing lands and revenues. These acts of governance were critical in a medieval kingdom, where the written word held power, and where neglecting a minor administrative detail could undermine the authority of the crown. John's obsession with minutiae might have earned him the nickname of reluctant ruler in modern retrospection, as he often prioritized the precise mechanics of rule over the grand gestures of kingship. Yet, it was this same attention to detail that allowed him to maintain the structure of his realm under immense pressure. Despite his competence in administration, John faced numerous challenges that eroded his support. By 1204, he had lost Normandy and other French territories to King Philip II of France. The loss was not simply a matter of military defeat, but also of logistical oversight and political miscalculation. John's chronicling of revenues and his attempts to enforce his claims often antagonized local barons, who were already wary of centralized power. Here, the seemingly boring details of taxation, land management, and feudal obligations intersected with high-stakes politics. Every scuffle over dues, every inspection of a fief, and every bureaucratic demand could trigger resentment that would grow into open rebellion. John's meticulousness, while admirable in the abstract, often alienated those who expected the king to balance firmness with flexibility. Even beyond politics, John's life was dominated by routine inspections and ceremonial duties. Medieval kings were expected to be visible symbols of authority, which meant endless tours of their kingdoms, presiding over courts, attending religious ceremonies, and entertaining foreign ambassadors. Each castle visit involved a precise schedule. Arrival times, meals, accommodations, and security arrangements all had to be coordinated to project competence and command respect. Such routines could be exhausting, yet they were vital for maintaining loyalty and asserting control in a decentralized medieval society. For John, this meant that his days were filled less with the drama of battle or intrigue than with the painstaking administration of a vast, complex realm. One of the most infamous aspects of John's reign was his financial policies. To fund wars and defend his holdings, John levied heavy taxes, fines, and scutage, a payment by vassals to avoid military service. While this seems straightforward, the process involved endless calculations, negotiations, and documentation. Every levy had to be justified, every exemption recorded, and every payment tracked. It was a repetitive and tedious process, but for John, it was essential. Mismanagement could lead not only to financial shortfalls, but to the perception of injustice, which in turn could ignite dissent. The Magna Carta, signed reluctantly in 1215, was a culmination of grievances that had been simmering for years, many of them rooted in John's meticulous yet unforgiving approach to governance. Yet, even in agreeing to this charter, John sought to retain as much control as possible, highlighting tension between daily administration and political necessity. John's reign, when stripped of drama and legend, offers a window into the quiet struggles of kingship. It reveals that being a medieval ruler was often less about grand gestures and more about managing details, enduring tedium, and navigating a web of obligations that could become lethal if mishandled. John's life reminds us that history is not only shaped by dramatic battles or heroic decisions, but also by the slow, persistent work of administration, the endless hours of paperwork, and the careful balancing of competing demands. And yet, despite his diligence, John remains one of the most controversial kings in history, admired by some for his skills and reviled by others for his failures. This duality raises a question: when does attention to detail become a liability, and how much can one man control the complex machinery of a medieval kingdom before the machinery starts to control him? John's story, however, is far from finished. His meticulous governance, his conflicts with barons, and his eventual signing of the Magna Carta represent only the beginning of a saga that would test his patience, his authority, and the resilience of his kingdom. The boring, mundane work of a king was about to collide with rebellion, warfare, and the relentless scrutiny of history. How would John navigate these pressures? And could his attention to detail save him from the consequences of his missteps? Or would it prove insufficient against forces beyond his control? By the early 1210s, King John's reign was increasingly defined by a series of mounting crises that were as much administrative as they were political. The slow accumulation of discontent among his barons, the relentless pressure of financing lost French territories, and John's own temperament created a perfect storm. What may appear, at first glance, to be the dry story of taxation disputes and feudal obligations was, in reality, the framework upon which one of the most famous legal documents in history, the Magna Carta, would eventually emerge. Yet to understand how it came about, it's crucial to look not only at the larger political events, but also at the monotonous, often overlooked details of governance that fed the growing tension. John's methods of rule, while painstakingly meticulous, frequently exacerbated the frustration of his barons. The scutage system, which allowed vassals to pay money instead of providing military service, was particularly contentious. At first, it seemed a practical solution. John could raise money without relying entirely on potentially unreliable or distant feudal levies. But in practice, the system required extensive bookkeeping. Sheriffs had to record each payment, calculate arrears, and ensure that each baron's obligation was met in precise proportion to their holdings. John personally oversaw many of these processes, sometimes reviewing accounts and receipts himself. While this might appear efficient or conscientious, it also created the impress that the king was obsessively exacting, even petty. A baron who missed a payment, no matter how small, risked immediate fines or confiscation of lands, a level of rigidity that provoked resentment in a feudal system built on mutual obligations rather than mechanical enforcement. The situation was further complicated by John's relationships with his church officials. The dispute over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1207 is a case in point. When the monks of Canterbury elected their preferred candidate, John rejected him, insisting on his own choice. Pope Innocent III intervened, resulting in England being placed under interdict, a suspension of most church services. For 3 years, the country existed in a strange limbo. Weddings were delayed, sacraments withheld, and the king was publicly criticized for challenging ecclesiastical authority. This period illustrates the tedious but crucial overlap between governance and religious life in medieval England. John had to navigate not only the secular obligations of his barons, but also the spiritual expectations of his subjects, all while trying to maintain revenue streams and political authority. Every correspondence with the Pope, every delay in approving an ecclesiastical appointment, and every negotiation over church revenues consumed hours of laborious negotiation. And yet, these bureaucratic disputes had profound effects on loyalty and public perception. Even within the royal household, John faced mundane yet politically significant challenges. The maintenance of royal castles, the provisioning of the court, and the movement of armies required constant attention. Castles were not merely military fortresses, they were administrative hubs, keeping track of who was stationed where, ensuring that stores of grain and arms were sufficient, and managing the flow of messengers and officials demanded pain. Staking record-keeping. Contemporary documents show that John regularly inspected accounts, checked on food stores, and reviewed reports from stewards. In theory, such attention to detail was sensible. In practice, it often delayed decisions or created a perception of micromanagement. The barons, meanwhile, perceived these administrative intrusions as burdensome oversight, contributing to their growing sense that John was more concerned with minutiae than with the honor or welfare of the nobility. The political pressure intensified as John's failures in foreign policy compounded domestic frustrations. The loss of Normandy in 1204 was a humiliation for the English crown and a financial disaster. Normandy had been a major source of income, and its forfeiture meant that John had to extract greater revenues from English lands to compensate. This in turn meant heavier taxation, more frequent scutages, and an ever-growing administrative workload. Each demand for money required careful documentation and negotiation, yet the barons perceived these measures as oppressive. The slow, bureaucratic grind of collecting taxes, recording debts, and enforcing penalties became a central source of unrest. What might appear as boring financial administration in reality formed the backbone of one of medieval England's most significant political crises. Tensions came to a head in 1214, when John attempted a military campaign to reclaim lost territories in France. Unlike the quick, decisive battles chronicled in heroic narratives, this campaign was characterized by painstaking logistics, the movement of supplies across difficult terrain, the coordination of feudal levies, and the maintenance of supply lines. John's obsession with detail manifested in countless letters and orders regarding troop movements, food rations, and payment for soldiers. Yet despite meticulous planning, the campaign ended in failure. The defeat at the Battle of Bouvines was less about dramatic battlefield heroics and more about a failure to coordinate multiple forces effectively. A reminder that even the most diligent attention to detail could not always overcome larger structural or political challenges. For John, this was both a personal humiliation and a further drain on the resources and patience of his barons. By 1215, the combination of fiscal pressure, military setbacks, and arbitrary enforcement of laws had reached a tipping point. The barons, frustrated and alarmed by John's policies, began to organize. Their grievances were specific and often tedious: disputes over wardships, inheritance, debts, and fines. These complaints, while seemingly mundane, reflected deeper anxieties about power, loyalty, and justice. The barons sought to limit the king's ability to act unilaterally and demanded formal recognition of their rights and privileges. The resulting negotiations culminated in the drafting of the Magna Carta, a document that, at its core, addressed the precise administrative and legal details that had sparked unrest: the right to fair taxation, protection from arbitrary imprisonment, and limitations on feudal obligations. While the Magna Carta is remembered today as a foundational legal document, at the time it was an intensely practical attempt to regulate the day-to-day relationship between king and barons, balancing authority and accountability in painstaking detail. Yet even in this moment of concession, John's meticulousness did not vanish. He continued to question, delay, and negotiate every clause, demonstrating that his attention to detail was inseparable from his approach to rule. The barons, in turn, were forced to navigate the slow, careful processes of negotiation and enforcement, knowing that the practical impact of the Magna Carta depended on the king's willingness to abide by its provisions. The document itself, seemingly a simple list of clauses, was in fact the product of hours of discussion, review, and compromise. It highlights the extraordinary significance of the otherwise boring mechanisms of governance, measurement, documentation, and oversight could shape the destiny of a kingdom. King John's approach to administration, however, also raised profound questions about the limits of power. Could a king maintain control by obsessing over the details, or did such focus inevitably alienate those whose cooperation was essential? Could legal documents like the Magna Carta truly restrain royal authority, or were they merely temporary instruments negotiated under pressure? John's reign suggests that even the most diligent and methodical attention to bureaucratic detail could not always prevent rebellion, nor could it fully secure loyalty. The balance between meticulous governance and political flexibility was a delicate one, and John, despite his talents, often struggled to maintain it. In reflecting on these events, it becomes clear that the boring, often tedious aspects of John's reign, financial administration, military logistics, correspondence with church officials, and monitoring feudal obligations, were in fact the very mechanisms that shaped the course of English history. These mundane processes, rather than dramatic battles or legendary deeds, produced lasting consequences, culminating in the Magna Carta. And yet, the story is not finished. While the Charter temporarily placated the barons, tensions simmered beneath the surface, and John's personal decisions, temperament, and ongoing administrative habits would continue to shape the kingdom in unpredictable ways. The question now arises, how would a king so meticulous and yet so inflexible respond when the fragile peace imposed by the Magna Carta began to unrave? The signing of the Magna Carta in June 1215 did not mark the end of conflict in King John's reign. It was only the beginning of a tense period in which the king's meticulous attention to detail, his obsession with control, and his contentious relationships with his barons would converge in dramatic yet understated ways. To fully understand this phase of John's life, we must return to the day-to-day realities of governance, the procedural minutiae that shaped every decision, and the quiet pressures that ultimately defined his legacy. Even after affixing his seal to the Magna Carta at Runnymede, John's immediate reaction was far from compliance. He carefully analyzed each clause, weighing the implications for his authority, financial control, and military obligations. The document was not a single sweeping statement of rights as it might appear in modern interpretation. It was a collection of highly technical stipulations, limitations on scutage, restrictions on fines, precise procedures for resolving disputes between the crown and barons. John's natural inclination was to question, challenge, and interpret each provision to his advantage. This behavior, while frustrating to the barons, reflects the painstaking mindset that had characterized his reign. Every word, every clause, every calculation mattered. And John treated the Magna Carta no differently than he would a record of revenue or a report from a sheriff. This methodical approach, however, collided with the impatience and growing mistrust of his barons. Within weeks of Runnymede, hostilities began to flare. Some barons refused to acknowledge John's authority fully, while others sought alliances with foreign powers, notably Prince Louis of France. John's meticulous management of military logistics came into play as he attempted to marshal his forces. Castles were inspected, supplies accounted for, and Troop M, movements carefully scheduled. Contemporary records reveal a king who, even in the face of rebellion, could be obsessive about inventory lists, weapon allocations, and the exact number of knights each baron could muster. The boredom and routine of these administrative tasks, often tedious and repetitive, were now inextricably linked to the fate of his kingdom. John's strategic patience, however, was continually undermined by his personality. His temper and tendency towards suspicion meant that he frequently acted impulsively in moments of political crisis. He confiscated lands, imprisoned dissenting barons, and issued harsh penalties, all actions that, while legally defensible in his meticulous view, inflamed opposition. The tension between John's careful administrative skills and his impulsive decision-making created an unstable environment. The kingdom was held together by the slow, deliberate work of bureaucracy, yet constantly threatened by the unpredictability of personal relationships and political alliances. The summer of 1215 saw England sliding toward open civil war. The barons invited Prince Louis to intervene, promising to support his claim to the English throne. John's response was strategic but laborious. He coordinated defences, reinforced key castles, and communicated with allies in a manner that required constant attention to detail. Each castle's garrison, each allocation of food and arms, and each message dispatched to regional officials was meticulously documented. The war that followed was less about pitched battles than about the careful application of resources, movement of supplies, and negotiation of loyalties. While these details may seem mundane compared to the drama of armed conflict, they were decisive in determining which areas of England remained loyal and which could be persuaded or coerced into submission. Despite his careful administration, John faced ongoing challenges. Disease, famine, and the natural unpredictability of medieval life compounded the political crises. Royal officials, overwhelmed by the scale of governance, sometimes failed to execute his instructions precisely, creating additional sources of friction. John's meticulous monitoring meant that even minor failures were noticed and addressed, though often too late to prevent the consequences. The mundane day-to-day work of ruling, inspecting granaries, counting men-at-arms, and reviewing correspondence, was now inseparable from the survival of the monarchy itself. Every list, ledger, and letter carried weight far beyond its apparent significance. By late 1215, John's persistent attention to administrative detail and tactical oversight began to yield results. He was able to hold key castles, maintain supply lines, and prevent Prince Louis from gaining an immediate foothold. Yet, his political position remained precarious. The Magna Carta, although initially intended to pacify the barons, had become a symbol of resistance, and John's inability, or unwillingness, to fully comply with it ensured continued unrest. His meticulous governance had preserved the functional integrity of the kingdom, but it had not resolved the underlying tensions. Here, the boring mechanisms of rule, tax collection, record-keeping, castle inspections, proved necessary for survival, yet insufficient for political stability. The final years of John's reign were marked by relentless pressure, illness, and reflection. His obsessive control over administrative processes continued, but he was increasingly aware of the limitations of his authority. Contemporary chroniclers describe a king who, in his last months, spent long hours reviewing accounts, issuing writs, and corresponding with his officials. These routines, seemingly dull and monotonous, were in fact the lifeblood of governance. Without them, the kingdom would have collapsed entirely. Yet, even as John labored over minutiae, he was haunted by the consequences of his failures: lost territories, rebellious barons, and the fragile peace imposed by the Magna Carta. John died on October 18, 1216, at the age of 49. His death came amidst continued civil strife, with the barons still divided and Prince Louis still a potential threat. Despite his many failures, John's meticulous attention to detail and bureaucratic skill left a lasting imprint on England. The Magna Carta, reissued and reinforced by his successors, would evolve into a foundational document for English law, demonstrating that even a controversial, often reviled king could inadvertently shape the future in profound ways. John's reign reminds us that history is shaped not only by grand gestures, heroic battles, or legendary narratives, but also by the boring, persistent work of administration, negotiation, and survival. It is in these seemingly mundane details that the resilience of a kingdom and the legacy of a ruler are truly revealed. In the quiet after his death, historians have debated John's character endlessly. Was he a tyrant or a competent administrator undermined by circumstances? The truth, as often is the case, lies in the intersection of both. His meticulous governance ensured that England survived years of rebellion, financial strain, and foreign threat, yet his rigidity, temper, and personal flaws fostered continual unrest. The lesson here is subtle. The ordinary painstaking tasks of ruling, ledger-keeping, castle inspections, correspondence, and regulation of minor disputes, can determine the fate of nations. History is not only the story of dramatic conquests, but of persistent, seemingly dull attention to everyday governance, a truth that King John's life embodies fully. And so, as you imagine the slow, methodical hours John spent reviewing accounts, adjusting troop placements, and negotiating with his barons, consider this: perhaps the most controversial king in medieval England was not remembered solely for what he did, but for the careful, meticulous processes he carried out in the background, the boring, repetitive work that shaped the kingdom's survival. How might history have remembered him differently if his attention to detail had been tempered with more flexibility, or if his administrative diligence had been applied with greater political tact? The quiet machinery of governance, after all, can be both a kingdom's salvation and a ruler's undoing. Charles VI of France, often remembered by historians as Charles the Mad, ruled during a period of political tension, dynastic conflict, and social upheaval that would leave enduring marks on France. His reign, which lasted from 1380 to 1422, was punctuated by intermittent episodes of mental illness. Yet the daily realities of his kingship reveal a quieter, more methodical aspect of rule, one that revolved around managing court bureaucracy, maintaining ceremonial order, and negotiating the mundane but crucial details of governance in a kingdom under strain. Understanding Charles VI requires exploring not just the dramatic episodes of madness, but the slower, repetitive tasks and everyday procedures that occupied the majority of a medieval monarch's life. Charles ascended to the throne at the tender age of 11, following the death of his father, Charles V. As a child king, he was initially guided by regents and advisors, most notably his uncles from the royal house of Valois. This early period is characterized less by heroic adventures or battles, and more by careful supervision of finances, legal administration, and court rituals. Even as a young monarch, Charles was exposed to the slow-moving machinery of governance. He observed the careful maintenance of royal records, the issuance of ordinances, and the negotiations over feudal obligations. These details may seem mundane, but they were critical for the survival of a kingdom still reeling from the ongoing 100 Years' War with England. One of the less glamorous aspects of Charles's early reign was the meticulous attention required to balance the royal treasury. France's economy in the late 14th century was under strain from war expenditures, intermittent famines, and the lingering effects of the Black Death, which had decimated the population a few decades earlier. Maintaining fiscal stability demanded persistent oversight, ensuring that tax collectors delivered the expected revenues, monitoring expenditures on military campaigns, and verifying accounts from local officials. Charles and his council spent hours poring over financial records, assessing the reliability of income streams, and planning for future needs. While these tasks were far from dramatic, they reveal the painstaking work required to keep a medieval kingdom functioning, a work that could be easily overlooked when historians focus solely on battles or royal intrigues. Even beyond financial administration, Charles' early years involved learning the ceremonial and ritual aspects of kingship. Court life was a highly regulated affair. Protocol dictated everything from seating arrangements at feasts to the precise timing of religious observances and the sequence of diplomatic audiences. Charles was educated in these routines from childhood, learning how to project authority through gestures, words, and adherence to tradition. While such details may seem trivial to a modern observer, they carried real political weight. Any misstep could offend a powerful noble or undermine the legitimacy of royal authority. The boredom of endless court ceremonies, rehearsals, and form. Processions was balanced by their importance in reinforcing social hierarchy and maintaining loyalty. As Charles matured, the pressures of ruling a kingdom embroiled in war became more pronounced. By his teenage years, France was still engaged in the intermittent conflicts of the Hundred Years' War, and his advisors faced the constant challenge of defending territories while financing campaigns. Charles himself was involved in reviewing military plans, correspondence with provincial governors, and monitoring troop levies. He quickly learned that kingship involved more than commanding armies. It required careful coordination of logistics, supply chains, and communication across a geographically and politically fragmented realm. Each decision, how many soldiers could be levied from a particular region, how provisions were distributed, which castles were reinforced, was tied to detailed records and administrative oversight. The king's effectiveness depended as much on the slow work of bureaucracy as on battlefield strategy. Despite these responsibilities, Charles's reign was also punctuated by personal challenges that directly affected governance. In 1392, he experienced the first of several severe episodes of mental instability, now thought to be some form of psychosis or severe paranoia. During these attacks, Charles would exhibit violent behavior, confusion, and a loss of rational thought. The most infamous incident occurred during a journey near Le Mans, when he attacked and killed some of his own knights, believing them to be enemies in disguise. For the court, these episodes required careful management. Advisors and family members had to step in to control access to the king, make critical decisions in his stead, and maintain the continuity of governance. This was far from the romanticized image of a heroic ruler. It was a grueling, repetitive exercise in crisis. Management, balancing care for the king with the ongoing needs of the state. The impact of Charles's mental health on day-to-day governance was profound yet subtle. Even in periods of relative stability, he remained subject to close monitoring. Advisors implemented elaborate schedules, sometimes moving him between palaces to avoid triggers, and ensuring that rituals, meals, and audiences proceeded without disruption. Court life became a carefully choreographed routine, with the king's condition dictating much of the daily schedule. Each adjustment, what he ate, how he was transported when he could meet nobles, required detailed record-keeping and constant vigilance. In this way, the supposedly mad king's life was, paradoxically, dominated by order, discipline, and bureaucratic oversight. Yet, despite these personal and political challenges, Charles's reign also demonstrates the resilience of ordinary governance. Local officials continued to manage their regions, tax collectors performed their duties, and royal courts continued to adjudicate disputes. The machinery of the state did not grind to a halt, simply because the monarch was incapacitated at times. Instead, it adapted, with advisors and bureaucrats filling in gaps, relying on written records, established procedures, and careful monitoring. The seemingly boring routines of administration, checking accounts, reviewing correspondence, maintaining inventories, were essential to the survival of the kingdom. In many ways, this quiet resilience underpinned France's ability to endure decades of war, famine, and internal unrest. Charles's early years also highlight a broader truth about medieval kingship. The line between ceremonial pomp and effective governance was thin. A king had to participate in ritual not only to assert legitimacy, but also to facilitate the day-to-day work of rule, the seemingly tedious observation of protocol, the ordering of feasts, and the careful attention to seating and precedence at court, all reinforced the social hierarchies necessary for administration. For Charles, mastering these details provided him with the tools to exercise authority, even during periods of mental instability. It was the ordinary, repetitive work, the boring elements of kingship that often ensured the continuity of power, even when extraordinary crises threatened to unravel it. By the end of this first section, Charles's reign has established a delicate tension, a kingdom struggling with war, finances, and disease, a king whose brilliance was shadowed by periodic madness, and a court whose meticulous routines kept the wheels of government turning despite unpredictability. The story of Charles VI is not only one of dramatic episodes of insanity, but of the slow, persistent, and often overlooked work that allowed a medieval kingdom to endure. The interplay between chaos and order, personal instability and bureaucratic diligence, would shape the remainder of his reign in ways that would affect France for decades. As Charles's life unfolds, questions linger. How does a kingdom survive when the very person at its center is intermittently incapable of ruling? Can routine, procedure, and bureaucratic oversight compensate for the unpredictability of a human mind? And how did the seemingly mundane decisions, the scheduling of courtly rituals, the careful monitoring of finances, the slow management of regional officials, interact with the dramatic events that have captured history's attention? The answers lie in the next section of Charles's story, where we will explore the consequences of his instability, the political maneuvering of his advisors, and the slow unraveling of authority that would characterize the later years of his reign. As Charles VI matured into adulthood, his periods of mental instability became more frequent and severe, creating a highly unusual situation in which the king's personal vulnerabilities directly shaped the governance of France. Unlike dramatic narratives of battlefield heroics or royal triumphs, the reality of Charles' reign was often a slow, painstaking negotiation between human frailty and bureaucrat. Icy necessity. The king's intermittent incapacitation demanded that his advisors, relatives, and local officials perform much of the routine work of governance, ensuring that the machinery of the state continued to function despite the unpredictability of the monarch. Charles's episodes of mental illness often struck suddenly. Contemporary accounts describe sudden outbursts of violence, delusional behavior, and periods during which he could not recognize his closest companions or recall prior decisions. One notable episode, occurring in 1392, saw Charles violently attack his own companions during a hunt near Le Mans, killing several and terrifying the court. Such incidents were more than personal tragedies. They created administrative crises, royal charters, tax collections, military orders, and diplomatic correspondence. All depended on a functioning monarch. When Charles could not perform these duties, his advisors had to step in, applying a combination of rigid procedure and improvisation to maintain continuity. The political consequences of Charles's illness were profound. France was governed by a complex system of regency councils and royal advisors, each vying for influence while attempting to manage the king's incapacity. Charles's uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, and Anjou, played central roles, using the king's episodes as opportunities to expand their own power. Yet the tasks they managed were deeply administrative, rather than purely political, supervising tax collection, issuing writs, maintaining court schedules, inspecting castles, and coordinating the movement of armies. These responsibilities required detailed record-keeping, repeated verification, and constant oversight. The court was, in many ways, a hive of boring activity, with advisors meticulously documenting every decision to prevent mismanagement during the king's absences. At the same time, France faced external threats from England as the Hundred Years' War continued to rage intermittently. Unlike earlier battles characterized by bold strategy and rapid movements, this phase of the conflict was dominated by logistics, supply lines, and resource management. The king's advisors had to ensure that castles remained stocked, troops were provisioned, and communication between regional commanders was maintained. Every decision, how many soldiers to levy from a province, how much grain to allocate, the timing of messengers carrying orders, depended on accurate record-keeping and coordination. Charles's intermittent incapacity meant that these operational tasks were critical to national survival, and the mundane, repetitive work of administration became the true backbone of France's war effort. Within the court, the ceremonial and ritualistic aspects of governance gained additional significance. Charles's episodes of madness could be triggered or exacerbated by disruptions to routine, so advisors and courtiers took great pains to preserve the regular rhythm of courtly life. Daily schedules included specific times for meals, audiences, religious observances, and leisure activities, all meticulously planned to provide stability for the king and predictability for the court. Even minor deviations could create anxiety or confusion, underscoring the importance of procedural order. The repetitive, seemingly trivial work of arranging seating, preparing feasts, and organizing processions was not mere decoration. It was an essential mechanism for managing both the monarch and the kingdom. Despite these administrative measures, the instability at the center of power created opportunities for conflict among the king's relatives and advisors. The Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, and Orleans each sought to assert influence during Charles's incapacitated periods, sometimes undermining, one another, or making contradictory decisions. Such rivalries complicated routine governance. Tax collectors received conflicting instructions, military commanders were uncertain about orders, and local officials struggled to navigate overlapping jurisdictions. Maintaining accurate records, verifying receipts, and confirming the chain of authority became an ongoing, tedious necessity. The mundane work of governance, documents, ledgers, writs, and schedules, was what prevented the kingdom from collapsing into chaos, even as personal rivalries threatened stability. Charles's reign was also marked by social unrest, including localized revolts and tensions caused by famine and economic stress. Peasants and townspeople already suffering from the lingering effects of the Black Death were particularly sensitive to taxation and the enforcement of feudal dues. Officials dispatched to collect revenue often faced resistance, and their actions had to be carefully monitored to avoid escalation. Again, this was not a matter of grand spectacle, but of persistent attention to the routine operations of administration, verifying tax rolls, recording exemptions, monitoring fines, and ensuring that local law enforcement carried out their duties appropriately. The seemingly boring work of oversight and procedural diligence was essential to maintaining a fragile equilibrium across the kingdom. A particularly illustrative episode occurred during Charles's periodic incapacity in 1397. His mental health deteriorated to the point that he could not participate in state councils, and his advisors had to convene in his absence to make decisions on taxation, justice, and military planning. Detailed minutes of these councils show extensive discussion of revenue collection, troop levies, and the logistical deployment of supplies. The focus was not on sweeping reforms or dramatic initiatives, but on maintaining continuity and order. Without this careful attention to repetitive administrative processes, local unrest and military weakness could have escalated into far more serious crises, highlighting how routine governance became the real foundation of royal authority during periods of instability. Even in matters of war, Charles's court relied heavily on procedural diligence. Campaigns required careful preparation, counting soldiers, allocating funds for equipment, scheduling supply deliveries, and ensuring lines of communication were intact. Advisors drafted lists, verified provisions, and coordinated movements across multiple provinces. The king's absence from direct decision-making did not halt military activity. It simply transformed warfare into a logistical exercise dominated by routine management. The contrast between the dramatic perception of medieval kingship and the slow, repetitive work that underpinned it is stark. Charles's reign illustrates that even amidst periods of madness, the mundane processes of record-keeping, oversight, and careful coordination could sustain the kingdom. By the early 15th century, the cumulative effect of Charles's mental health crises, external threats, and internal rivalries became increasingly visible. France's administration had survived because of persistent, disciplined attention to the boring details of governance, but cracks in the system were beginning to show. Conflicting orders from rival factions, delays in revenue collection, and inefficiencies in military logistics undermined the kingdom's capacity to respond to both internal and external pressures. The interplay between human vulnerability and the persistent work of bureaucratic oversight became the defining feature of Charles's reign. The kingdom endured, but only through relentless attention to detail and constant adaptation. Charles VI's life reminds us that medieval kingship was not solely defined by battles, speeches, or dynastic marriages. It was also shaped by the repetitive, painstaking work of administration, the careful orchestration of courtly rituals, and the meticulous monitoring of finance, law, and military logistics. These elements, often overlooked in traditional narratives, were critical to the survival of France during one of its most turbulent periods. The contrast between the dramatic episodes of mental illness and the mundane continuity of government highlights a broader truth. History is not only shaped by extraordinary events, but also by the quiet, repetitive processes that sustain societies through instability. As we move toward the final section of Charles VI's story, questions linger. How did the interplay between the king's mental instability, the administrative diligence of his advisors, and the complex network of feudal and bureaucratic obligations shape France's ability to endure decades of turmoil. Could a kingdom survive long-term when the human element at its center was so unpredictable? Or was it the painstaking, repetitive work of governance that ultimately preserved stability? The answers to these questions emerge in the concluding section, where we will witness the culmination of Charles VI's reign and reflect on the enduring lessons of ruling amidst chaos. The final years of Charles VI's reign, from the early 15th century until his death in 1422, were defined by the slow, grinding intersection of personal vulnerability, bureaucratic persistence, and political instability. By this time, the king's episodes of mental illness had become increasingly frequent and severe, and the Kingdom of France had endured decades of war, famine, and social upheaval. Yet despite, or perhaps because of, the persistent efforts of his advisors, the machinery of governance continued to function. The story of Charles VI's late reign is not one of heroic triumphs, but of meticulous, routine administration that ensured the survival of a kingdom, even when its monarch was intermittently incapacitated. Charles' incapacity necessitated an unprecedented reliance on regents and royal councillors. The king's uncles, particularly the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, and Orleans, exercised considerable authority during periods when Charles could not participate in governance. However, these individuals were often in competition, leading to conflicts over appointments, taxation, and military strategy. In this environment, the role of documentation and bureaucracy became paramount. Every decision had to be carefully recorded, cross-checked, and verified. Letters, charters, and council minutes were meticulously maintained to prevent confusion and to ensure that royal authority, even if exercised indirectly, remained recognizable and enforceable. These tedious tasks were essential for continuity, demonstrating how routine administrative diligence could compensate, at least partially, for the unpredictability of the monarch. The 100 Years' War continued to cast a long shadow over France, and Charles's episodes of incapacity complicated military planning. Campaigns required careful orchestration, provisioning armies, coordinating troop movements, and ensuring that regional commanders understood their orders. Advisors managed these logistics in the king's absence, creating detailed lists and schedules that sometimes rivaled modern planning documents in their precision. Even the mundane, repetitive aspects of military administration, counting soldiers, allocating funds, confirming supplies, played a decisive role in preserving France's defensive capabilities. Without these measures, the kingdom might have disintegrated under external pressure, highlighting the quiet, almost invisible work that supported royal authority during a period of profound instability. Internal politics were equally affected by Charles's condition. Rival factions at court leveraged the king's incapacity to advance their own agendas, often exacerbating tensions between nobles, regional governors, and royal officials. Disputes over appointments, taxation, and legal enforcement required constant mediation, negotiation, and documentation. Advisors and bureaucrats had to maintain meticulous records to ensure that decisions were enforceable and consistent. In essence, the administrative routines that might seem boring or trivial, the verification of accounts, the drafting of writs, the scheduling of council meetings, became the foundation upon which the kingdom's political stability rested. Charles's reign demonstrates that the survival of a monarchy often depended less on charisma or military genius than on persistent, detail-oriented governance. Despite these administrative measures, France experienced periods of social unrest and vulnerability. Famine, economic disruption, and the lingering impact of plague outbreaks challenged the kingdom's resources. Tax collectors, responsible for funding both civil and military needs, faced resistance from peasants and townspeople, necessitating careful monitoring and repeated enforcement. The king's advisors implemented procedural systems to manage these pressures, recording exemptions, monitoring collections, and coordinating responses to unrest. These repetitive, bureaucratic tasks were essential for preventing localized issues from escalating into broader crises. Charles's reign illustrates that the seemingly dull routines of governance ledgers, reports, inspections, and correspondence were often the mechanisms that preserved national cohesion during periods of extraordinary instability. The ceremonial aspects of kingship remained surprisingly important even in Charles's later years. Court rituals, public appearances, and religious observances were carefully managed to maintain the image of a functioning monarchy. Advisors coordinated schedules, rehearsed ceremonies, and ensured that the king's intermittent participation was consistent and orderly. These repetitive tasks reinforced legitimacy, signaling to both domestic and foreign audiences that the monarchy, despite its challenges, retained authority. In this context, what might appear as tedious protocol was in fact a crucial stabilizing factor, demonstrating the subtle power of routine in sustaining political structures. Charles's death in 1422 marked the end of a reign that had spanned more than 4 decades, a period characterized by extraordinary personal challenges and the relentless pressures of governance. His passing left France exhausted by war, divided by factionalism, and struggling to recover economically and socially. Yet, the persistence of administrative routines, the careful documentation of decisions, and the disciplined management of court and state affairs had allowed the kingdom to endure. Without these seemingly mundane practices, France might have disintegrated entirely under the combined weight of internal strife and external threat. The lesson of Charles VI's reign is subtle but profound. History is not shaped solely by dramatic events or charismatic leaders, but also by the slow, repetitive work that sustains institutions over time. Charles's legacy is complex. While often remembered as the Mad King, this label obscures the quiet resilience embedded in his administration. His reign illustrates that even during periods of extreme personal incapacity, the survival of a kingdom relies on careful record-keeping, bureaucratic diligence, and the steady execution of routine respo. Sensibilities. The delicate balance between chaos and order, human vulnerability and procedural discipline, is what allowed France to emerge from this period relatively intact. Charles's story also highlights the importance of advisors, bureaucrats, and court officials, the individuals whose work is rarely celebrated but whose attention to detail ensured the functioning of the state. As you imagine the daily life of Charles VI's court, the endless drafting of charters, verification of accounts, organization of feasts, coordination of armies, and careful scheduling of religious rituals, consider how the repetitive, boring tasks of administration shaped the fate of a kingdom. The survival of France during decades of war and instability was not determined solely by dramatic events, but by the cumulative effect of meticulous routines, procedural diligence, and constant oversight. Charles's life demonstrates that sometimes the most significant historical forces are not the heroic or legendary moments, but the quiet, persistent work of governance that underpins the continuity of societies. The story of Charles VI leaves us with a reflective question: when a leader is fallible, distracted, or incapacitated, how much of a kingdom's survival depends on the routine diligence of the people around them, and how often does history overlook these mundane but essential contributions, focusing instead on the dramatic, sensational, or chaotic events that capture the imagination? In the case of Charles VI, the answer lies in the unglamorous but critical details, the boring history that, in fact, kept France alive through its most turbulent years. Henry VIII of England, crowned in 1509, is often remembered for his 6 marriages, his break with the Catholic Church, and the creation of the Church of England. These dramatic episodes dominate popular imagination, but the day-to-day reality of Henry's kingship reveals a different story, one of meticulous administration, obsessive oversight, and a constant concern for the practicalities of governance. Understanding Henry VIII requires looking past the sensational headlines of romantic scandal and rebellion to the slower, more repetitive work that consumed the majority of his reign. Henry ascended the throne at the age of 17, succeeding his father, Henry VII, a ruler known for his fiscal prudence and careful consolidation of power. The young king inherited a kingdom that was financially stable, but still recovering from the upheaval of civil war and dynastic struggle. From the beginning, Henry was engaged in the mundane but essential work of governance, reviewing tax records, supervising the collection of customs duties, monitoring royal estates, and attending to legal disputes brought to the king's court. While these responsibilities may seem dull compared to battlefield exploits or courtly intrigue, they were fundamental to the effective exercise of royal authority. Every ledger he examined, every account verified, and every writ issued contributed to the stability of the realm. One of the most overlooked aspects of Henry VIII's early reign was his personal involvement in administration. Unlike some monarchs who delegated extensively, Henry often took an active role in reviewing financial accounts and scrutinizing reports from officials across the kingdom. Detailed records show him examining the income from royal estates, ensuring that rents were collected, and verifying that expenditures on construction projects, military preparations, and court ceremonies were justified. These tasks required hours of careful attention and a level of detail that would appear almost obsessive to modern observers. Yet they were central to Henry's understanding of his kingdom's resources and his ability to make informed decisions about military campaigns, infrastructure, and patronage. Henry's court was also characterized by strict adherence to ritual and ceremonial procedure, a focus that both reinforced his authority and maintained the cohesion of his administration. Court life was highly structured. Daily schedules dictated when the king received petitions, conducted audiences, or attended religious services. Seating arrangements at banquets, the order of introductions at court, and even the timing of meals were carefully managed. For Henry, these routines were not merely ornamental, they served as a means of asserting control and ensuring that the machinery of governance functioned smoothly. Each formal event required preparation, oversight, and verification, making the seemingly mundane work of court management an essential component of kingship. The early years of Henry's reign also involved careful oversight of England's military resources. While his kingdom was not immediately at war, the king and his council prepared for potential conflicts in Scotland, France, and Ireland. Military readiness involved detailed planning, maintaining garrisons, inspecting armories, assessing the number of trained soldiers in each region, and ensuring that funds were available for supplies. Henry was deeply involved in these administrative aspects, reviewing muster rolls, calculating costs, and monitoring expenditures. The meticulous attention to detail was characteristic of a king who recognized that the security of his kingdom depended not only on personal courage or battlefield skill, but on the relentless management of resources, personnel, and logistics. Religious oversight was another area where Henry VIII displayed an unusual level of involvement early in his reign. While still formally a Catholic monarch, he closely monitored the activities of church officials, ensuring that clerical revenues were properly recorded and that church estates contributed to the crown's financial needs. The king reviewed records of tithes, rents, and donations, and he intervened in disputes between local priests and lay people when necessary. These routine, bureaucratic interventions may seem minor, but they reflected Henry's broader concern with maintaining order and asserting royal authority across every level of society. Even before his famous break with Rome, Henry demonstrated a keen understanding that governance relied on careful oversight and consistent enforcement of laws and obligations. Despite his administrative diligence, Henry was also deeply concerned with personal reputation and appearance. Maintaining the image of a strong, capable, and dynamic monarch required continuous effort, overseeing the construction and decoration of royal palaces, supervising the production of luxurious clothing and regalia, and ensuring that the court's ceremonies projected wealth and power. These tasks, while often considered superficial, were intertwined with the mundane workings of governance. A well-presented court attracted loyalty, facilitated diplomacy, and reinforced the king's authority. Henry's personal investment in these details demonstrates how seemingly trivial matters could have substantial political and administrative significance. Henry's personal habits also reflected his engagement with routine governance. Contemporary accounts describe a king who spent hours reading, reviewing documents, and corresponding with officials throughout the kingdom. On leisure activities, such as hunting, were imbued with administrative significance. Hunting parties were opportunities to inspect royal forests, review local management of resources, and interact with regional officials in an informal setting. In these ways, the daily life of Henry VIII blended personal interest, ceremonial obligation, and bureaucratic oversight, creating a rhythm that sustained the kingdom and reinforced his control. By the end of this first section, it is clear that Henry VIII's reign cannot be understood solely through the lens of his marriages, religious reforms, or political rebellions. The slower, repetitive work of administration, finance, military planning, and ceremonial oversight formed the backbone of his authority and ensured the functioning of the kingdom. The dramatic events, often highlighted in history books, were built upon a foundation of tedious but essential daily tasks. Henry's early reign illustrates a broader truth about monarchy. The continuity of a state depends on the careful, methodical work performed behind the scenes, often invisible to contemporaries and later historians alike. As we move forward in Henry VIII's story, questions arise. How did the mundane routines of administration interact with the king's more impulsive, controversial decisions? To what extent could meticulous oversight prevent political crises? And where did it fall short? And how did these seemingly boring aspects of kingship shape the broader trajectory of England during one of its most famous and tumultuous reigns? The next section will explore these dynamics as Henry navigates the growing tensions of court politics, religious disputes, and international challenges.